I wanted to include my tribal affiliation, which is Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. I'm a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. And it's from that particular vantage, being Miami and being a professor of Native American Studies, that I've organized my thoughts today, although I'm also a linguist. I've titled this presentation Toward an Indigenous Relational Approach to Reframing Native Speaker. And I think that the emphasis here will become apparent as we go. I will note up front, however, that the word toward, the first word, is important. I'm not giving the final indigenous relational approach. Rather, I'm talking about a way to move toward that with the recognition that my thoughts are preliminary and that other people can and should add to them. To give a basic overview of today's presentation, part of it is an overview of myself. I'll note that in most contexts, I use the term presenter, but in this case, I wanted to use the term speaker to have a little bit of fun with the word. I'm going to talk a little bit about my engagement with Native American and especially Miamia or Miami language reclamation. I'll talk about settler colonialism in Native North America, which guides ideas and practices about Native American languages and the people who speak or don't speak those languages. This then leads into a more critical discussion of how Native speakerhood, or just speakerhood, is viewed and operationalized in Native North American contexts, especially those that engage language sciences. And my main focus is to reframe language use and users through indigenous notions of relationality. But I really wanted to start with this part, Nila Miamia. Nila Miamia. I am Miami. When I was a child in the 1980s, I didn't know how to say Nila Miamia. In fact, I don't recall hearing the word Miamia until I was a young adult, even though I've always been very engaged in my tribal community, which is officially, as noted, known as the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. This is because Oklahoma is the current seat of government following 2 forced removals from our original homelands in Indiana. When I was young, I only knew and used the anglicized form, which is Miami, also pronounced Miami. For today's audience, I assume I don't need to explain the significance of being able to express one's relationship to a community in the community's language, especially in this case, because many so-called experts have referred to our language as extinct. Some people are said to wear their identities on their sleeves. I chose to wear mine on my chest. And so what you see here in the image is a picture of a t-shirt. And I have also, by the way, dressed for the occasion. I pursued a PhD in linguistics with the goal of supporting Miamia language reclamation, and I had to deal with things like this, what you see on the right. Note the paradox. The Ethnologue, just a catalog that gives basic descriptions of languages that are known within the context of Western science, at the time, and this is from 2005, described Miamia with the word extinct, or the E word as we sometimes say, yet also, and interestingly, on the same page described revitalization efforts and people using the language. Raises a number of questions. What kind of a paradox or what kind of thinking allows this sort of mismatch? This is a topic I'm going to get to shortly. Before I go farther, in addition to giving thanks to the organizers of this symposium for inviting me to share my thoughts, I wanted to acknowledge some of the people I learn a lot from. I put at the top here diverse users of languages, particularly of the Miamia language and other Native North American languages. I give a shout out to Indigenous scholars, particularly Indigenous linguists who critically theorize Indigenous language use and userhood, such as Carrie Chu, who's from the Chickasaw Nation, Jenny Davis, who's also from the Chickasaw Nation, and my longtime collaborator, Megan Lukanik, who is Huron-Wendat. course, it goes without saying, I learned a lot from many members of the Roll Collective and the broader networks of critical language scholars they are engaged with. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the faculty learning community on the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in Linguistics that I'm part of. I'll note that we were going to meet this morning, but we instead chose to come to this symposium. And I know that many of my colleagues pictured here are actually watching this talk. This is an image of us from 4 years ago at the Linguistic Society of America meeting when it was happening in New Orleans. But for those who aren't familiar with it, the idea of this group is to theorize and operationalize better ways of teaching linguistics and to incorporate the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, which is a named approach. This group talks a lot about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. By extension, we talk a lot about various isms, if you will, such as racism, sexism, essentialism, and many more. A key ism that underlies my presentation today guides the everyday experiences of members of my Miami community and of many other Indigenous communities. And that underlying ism is settler colonialism, which is basically the replacement of Indigenous peoples and lands by settlers and their polities and their linguistic landscapes, including notions of speakerhood. Settler colonialism entails genocide, removal, and erasure of Indigenous peoples and languages. Asserting and or assuming that Indigenous peoples are inferior, deficit theories, if you will. Establishing an imagined pure, that's in big quotation marks, historical norm as the only way to be a real blank, Miami, for example, or do blank in an authentic, again in quotation marks, way. This third bullet speaks to a particular brand of essentialism in that it creates a prototype that very few, if any, people actually meet. And settler colonialism at its core includes imposition and naturalization of settlers' needs, power structures, and beliefs in knowledge systems. I'll note that I think of today's symposium specifically as being about reframing native speakerhood, but in a more general sense, it's really about disrupting dominant beliefs and knowledge systems through critical analysis and intervention. This underlying theme guides a lot of my work in what I call language reclamation. I'll note that when I started in this endeavor about 30 years ago, I used the term that was more common at the time, which is language revitalization. But I came to find that that term or that effort focused overly, in my opinion, on documenting the language of so-called native speakers and then leveraging that knowledge to create new native speakers. What I came to recognize is that I was really engaging with reversing the underlying issues, particularly the oppression enacted via colonial power structures that led to my community and so many others to lose access to our languages in the first place. That recognition then led me to a new framing, which is language reclamation, by which I'm including common so-called language revitalization strategies, but emphasizing their link to broader efforts by a community to claim its right to speak a language and to set associated goals in response to community needs and perspectives. And crucially, in response to the historical and contemporary factors that contribute to language shift. Engaging in language reclamation for a number of years, as somebody with a PhD in linguistics who has remained active in the field of linguistics, despite being in Native American studies as a matter of my position, led me to start critiquing the field of linguistics itself. Many of you who've seen my previous presentations have seen some version of this slide, which notes that linguistics is not the same as linguistics. The key is in the capitalization. By capital L linguistics, I'm referring to the central content, scope, and conventions of investigation and teaching in the discipline called capital L linguistics. And I want to differentiate that from lowercase l linguistics, which I conceive of very, very broadly. I ask you what descriptions might go under lowercase l linguistics on this slide, or what descriptions should go there. There's a lot of discussion in areas of capital L linguistics of gatekeeping, of linguists being told that they're not really linguists or that the work that they do isn't real linguistics. All of that, I'm certain, would fall within capital L, or excuse me, lowercase l linguistics, although part of my goal is to reframe capital L linguistics to accommodate those people and their ideas in a productive way. But bringing it back then to today's focus, how about this one? It's a tool to critique how power structures guide today's topics. Speakers with a capital S is not the same as speakers with a lowercase s. Focusing in particular on the Native American context that I'm most familiar with. In Native American linguistic work, capital L speakers, as I'm conceiving of it, refers to the group that counts the most, and also that gets counted the most. And I use that in a literal sense of enumeration, 1 speaker, 2 speakers, 3 speakers. It's very, very common in capital L linguistics to enumerate the number of speakers of a given indigenous language. And yet it is lowercase s speakers, the much larger and very diverse group that actually exists in most Native American contexts. I'll note here, if you look at the top of the slide, I use the term power structures in the title. And part of this was based on my intention or my desire, to be parallel with the previous slide, but it also reflects some additional consideration. When I was drafting this presentation in an earlier version, I had the term ideology instead of power structures in recognition that today's symposium heavily engages language ideologies, and that would work fine here. Still, I wanted to put more emphasis on power, as I think this is such a key variable to issues of describing and theorizing language use. And that's why I made the decision that I did. Here's an image I'd like for you to ponder with me. We have a caricature of a speaker. And I ask, beyond leaving out signers, what else is problematic about speaker or native speaker as an undefined, unmarked category? Well, of course, many answers to this question have already been covered in today's symposium, so I'll just reiterate the importance of what others have already noted. Yet there is one special point that I want to mention about indigenous language reclamation contexts, especially in North America, where there's a very common practice of using the term speaker to refer only to fluent users who acquired the language under consideration as children. In other words, the word speaker by itself implies what in language sciences usually would be understood as a narrow definition of native speaker. I'll further note that in many communities, such as my own, there are very few people who actually meet that prototype. In fact, in my community, there aren't any at all. If we use that prototype as an arbiter of authenticity, by extension, what we're saying is that all Miami people are inauthentic. Please consider the implications of that. This brings me back to language reclamation. As part of this framework, note that it's important to recognize and valorize diverse ways of using language, diverse ways of being a language user, if you will. It's important to recognize and valorize that in Native North American reclamation contexts, most language users are language learners, and that it is common and important and valuable to play both of those roles at the same time. Another practice involves recognizing and valorizing that many members of these Native, and note the capital N, communities want to be Native, note the capital N again, speakers. But this is not the same as being a lowercase n Native speaker. Here I'm talking about, when I say capital N Native, I'm talking about Native American, usually implying indigenous, which also has a capital I. Of course, the particular parameters that this entails will vary locally because Native nations are quite diverse and have a lot of diversity within them. it creates a bit of a challenge for our purposes today to differentiate capital N Native, as in Native American, versus lowercase n Native, the focus of most of the symposium. And this becomes particularly challenging when writing in English and using conventions of capitalization, where either form might end up capitalized by virtue of being in a title or being at the beginning of a sentence. But what I'm getting at here is that many people who are working in a reclamation context, they want to be members and to be able to speak as members or sign as members of their respective communities in ways that are culturally grounded. They want to be native with a capital N. I acknowledge, that this particular framing can, and in many cases does, have very essentialist overtones. Yet I believe that framing them through a reclamation orientation can provide a counterbalance of sorts. I'm not imposing what capital N Native entails or what it should entail for a particular context or for a particular person. Rather, I'm recognizing that the goal of language reclamation in many cases, is to become that or to exhibit that or to speak in that particular way, whatever that is. This brings me then to a critique, sorts of things that language reclamation responds to. First, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about language documentation theory and practice, which is rife with native speakerism. I'll note that sometimes I see the term native speaker written as one word, especially in social media. And I chose to adopt that convention for this slide because I think doing so makes a lot of sense. In context of language documentation, native plus speaker often functions, as a single word whose meaning is far more specific than its component parts. I'll note that in language documentation, there's often a very strong emphasis on finding good speakers. And that usually means native speaker in a very narrow sense of the term, lowercase n, but sometimes also uppercase n. There's an assumption in many of these contexts that that only authentic, in quotation mark, speakers count. And not surprisingly, grant funding is prioritized for languages with few native speakers. And interestingly, the presence of other types of language users is not widely considered. It is not at all unusual when talking about indigenous languages for people to say something like, language X has only 3 speakers, even when there might be, say, for example, 1,000 people who use the language on an everyday basis. The comment there is framed around native speakers and leaves everybody else out. Following this, there are actually very, very few regular, if you will, indigenous language documentation projects without native speakerism. When I say regular, I mean something that's trying to document the way that a language is used in the fullest possible way, although that's not what it's actually doing. There are contexts where people will document called non-native speakers, but only if they really have to, is what I found. This line of thinking shows up in the National Science Foundation's Dynamic Language Infrastructure / Documenting Endangered Languages program, part of the solicitation for which appears here. So those of you who are familiar with the National Science Foundation know that grant proposals are weighed on 2 basic criteria: the intellectual merit, the scientific parts, and what the National Science Foundation calls broader outcomes or social benefits, that emerge from the project in question. And many of you know that many of the National Science Foundation's grant solicitations include additional criteria for that particular grant program. So these are the additional criteria for the Dynamic Language Infrastructure / Documenting Endangered Languages program. And I draw your attention to the bottom part. Discussion of collaborations and other arrangements made with the speaker community, which may include reference to the training of native speakers in the practice of linguistics and to the production of resources useful to the community of native speakers. Does anybody else find this very strange? Keep in mind that many of the languages that are being documented in this program have very, very, very few native speakers. And that the broader impacts are usually things like dictionaries, learning resources, texts, recorded conversations that are aiming to help other people become speakers. Why not just say, production of resources that will be useful to the language community? And yet that native speaker part is so robust and so strong that here it is showing up. I've been working on getting this changed, and I hope that I'll be able to soon, but there are a number of snags involved. And the so-called last speaker or last native speaker discourses are common, and let me be very clear, they inhibit reclamation. The framing is hugely problematic. In a practical sense, if a language is deemed to be extinct after the passing of the last, if you will, native speaker, even when there may be many other users or potential users around, support for this language, such as grants to fund language programs, becomes very, very limited. Similarly, language scientists who operate within a colonial frame of native speakerism are much less likely to be engaged in efforts within these language communities. If you look up last speaker through a Google search, you'll find many, many examples. I shared a few here on the right, and also I shared an example of a book that's framed around last speakers. Although, of course, we're not really last, or they're not really last. The University of Connecticut, I found this last night, has a whole website framed around last speakers around the world. And this framing is also hugely problematic. So what's really going on here? And why is it that the first Americans, First Nations, always end up being last? It raises a question then, how can languages, language issues, and language users, and so on be represented in better ways? This is the main part of my presentation. Well, part of it, of course, is questioning who is defining speaker and in what way. My interest for the moment is twofold. When asking defined by whom, I'm referencing power relations because the person or persons in question always exist in a series of power relations. And I'm also interested in some of the specific possibilities for changing the term speaker or the ideas around it and native speaker in ways that support language reclamation. So I want to share a couple of examples that come out of some work that I did with Aaron Haynes back in 2006 and 2007, and reported on in a 2010 paper called Making Collaboration Collaborative, that some of you are familiar with. The context was that Aaron and I engaged in collaborative consultations, which are a type of open interview about notions of native speakerhood. Aaron talked to Myra Johnson, a Northern Paiute speaker, and at the time, the Warm Springs, Oregon language program director. And I spoke with Daryl Baldwin from my own nation, a Miamia language reclamation leader and director of the Miamia Center at Miami University in Ohio. Myra Johnson had this to say: "It's strange that we would leave it up to linguists to define who's a fluent speaker. When I first came to work for the tribes in the language program, the linguists were determining who is fluent. And I thought in my mind, there's nobody that can determine the fluency of people other than the people themselves, and it shouldn't be anybody else." Daryl noted, "I just never felt comfortable to think that it was my place to question whether someone was a speaker. If they felt they were a speaker, if they had knowledge to share about that language, then they were a speaker of that language." Note here that Daryl is referencing something about sort of sharing. This brings up relationships, and this is the point I want to emphasize next. Relationships are everything in my tribal community. Relationships are always at the center. Or if we nominalize that, we can say relationality, the notion that everything is interrelated and by extension, interdependent. When I talk about relationality, the notion of being accountable to the relations in question follows as a matter of course. And so I tend to use the terms as one of the same, but some people will differentiate them. When we talk about relationality, a number of other concepts that start with the letter R come to mind: respect, relevance, reflection, reciprocity, responsibility, and rights, among others. I'm thinking of all of these concepts surrounding that more central concept of relationships. And I'm thinking of all of these being considered in relation to the others. I'll note that the ideas we've been discussing in today's symposium are co-produced in context of particular relationships, particularly power relationships. Here, what I want to do is to center relationships as a baseline. These relationships, by the way, include humans with other humans, humans with lands, non-human relations, people with political systems, all sorts of relationships. And I want to share with you an idea that I've been thinking through, which is the notion then of a relationality quotient. Not sure that I'm going to stay with this term, but it works for the time being. My goal here is to call attention to how recognizing, affirming, and being accountable to relationships, whether in research or in teaching or in other contexts, happens to varying degrees. Hence, I was thinking of a quotient. You can have less of that or more of that. And for the quotient itself, as a way of thinking through terms such as native speaker, I pose the following question: does whatever description, label, or category, to the extent possible for the particular context, demonstrate and facilitate relational accountability? Keeping in mind that a language reclamation orientation firmly recognizes that colonization and other forms of oppression disrupt relationships of people to their own lands and to their own languages, a general question is, does the description, label, or category lend itself to supporting people in strengthening, or, in cases where ruptures have been particularly severe, newly rebuilding those relationships? And in doing so, or in choosing that particular description, label, or category, does the choice align with the other R concepts? Let's return to this image that we saw earlier, to which I've added a question at the top. So here we have the idea of speaker, and I ask all of you, are people thinking relationally when they use this term? Presumably some people are, but I think that a lot of what we've been discussing in today's symposium is that many people are not. They're just using the term without considering and engaging the relationships that are involved. Rather than overly focusing on a fixed prototype of a so-called idealized language user, which of course excludes a large number of people, the majority of people who are arguably engaged in meaningful language learning and use, I suggest that a relational approach to assessing and describing linguistic proficiency and patterns of use draws attention to more important questions, such as what relationships allow people to know and use their languages in culturally grounded ways? And are those relationships in place? If not, what could bring them into place? Several R concepts are useful for understanding the details that inform the general questions I just posed. Do language users, for example, feel that their language use is relevant? Do community members and others, including scholars who are not members of the community in question, exhibit the appropriate respect for the language and its users? If not, what might have created this? When somebody is choosing to use a loaded term such as native speaker, are they being responsible to the local context? And to the ways in which the term will likely be understood and operationalized by others? For language researchers, such as those who engage in the language documentation practices I talked about a few minutes ago, how does their use of categories and labels help guide them to engage in the reciprocity that is expected, and in my opinion, needed as part of community-engaged research models? I'll note that it's very hard to exercise true reciprocity when some of the key people are being left out, as often occurs when categories and labels are uncritically employed. So I'll conclude with a couple of questions. The first one I've already posed. How can languages, language issues, language users, etc., be represented in better ways? And more specifically then, to a context of language reclamation, I ask, how can we all support native, and note the capital N, language users, including people who are called native speakers, while contesting native speakerism? Mishinewe, big thanks for allowing me to share my thoughts with you today.